According to Irish Ghost Hunter Elliott O'Donnell, Canada is a much haunted country. One account of a Canadian haunting was given to him by a French-Canadian named Bertram Armand. Though born and educated in Canada, he had served in Algeria in the French Foreign Legion. Retired, he returned to Canada, where the following event occurred. My home, he told O'Donnell, was in a small town called Garvois, southwest of Winnipeg. I had got out of the train at Winnipeg and dined at a hotel before setting out on my long tramp. "If you take my advice, sir," the landlord said, "you will avoid the wood of Garvois after dark." "Why?" I asked. "Because, sir," he responded, "because it bears an evil reputation." "An evil reputation?" I laughed. "I have been away for 10 years, and I'm dying to see my father. He is the only relative I have, so I want to go by the quickest route, and the road through the wood is quickest, right?" The landlord shrugged his shoulders. "Yes," he said, "the road over the plain is longer, but monsieur, if you go by the wood, you may never reach home at all." "I will risk it," I laughed, and putting my pack on my back, I stepped out onto the broad brown track leading to Garvois. Within an hour of my departure, the weather took a sudden turn for the worse, and the rain came down in torrents, the rain turning the trail into a swamp that was becoming dangerous. I trudged on, and was soon ankle-deep in mud. But at last I reached the forest. I'm not the nervous type, but the relative silence disturbed me. It seemed an assumed silence, and the prelude to something hostile. In the gloom, the trees had strange shapes, and I saw lights too, all kinds of colored lights. I fancied I heard steps behind me. I paused and looked over my shoulder, but nothing, only the gloom. I continued to advance, however, and was finally brought to a halt by a stone wall about 4 feet in height. I was wondering what to do next, when a female voice suddenly called out, "Keep along by the wall, and I will meet you at the gate." Well, naturally I obeyed. A few yards beyond stood the muffled-up figure of a woman. In a few words, I explained I had lost my way and needed a place to rest. "I don't mind sleeping anywhere," I said, "so long as it is dry. An attic, barn, anything will do." "I think I can offer you something better than that," she said, and led me along a narrow, winding path to a large, low, rakish-looking house. Inside, there was a rush of strange, musty air and darkness. "I must apologize for the absence of light," the woman said. "If we had been expecting you, it would have been different. If you follow me, I will take you to your room." I tried to see her face, but was frustrated by the way she held the lantern. Nor could I see my surroundings, but I had the curious feeling that I had been there before. We ascended a staircase, then stepped down a corridor, finally halting before a half-open doorway. "This is your room," she said. "You may, if you like, open the windows. We have been obliged to keep them closed owing to the damp. Good night." She turned to go, and I saw her face. It was exquisite, my wildest dreams of feminine beauty. Who was she? I kept asking myself that question long after she had left me, and the echoes of her high-heeled shoes along the passage and down the stairs had ceased. Who was she? Indeed, I was so obsessed with her that I paid no heed to my strange situation. I undressed where I was and then, making a guess at the direction of the bed, walked cautiously forward until I collided with the bedstead, a large brass one. It was but the work of a moment to throw back the sheets, and then, with my mind full of visions of my newly found goddess, I sank into a deep, refreshing sleep. I woke with a start to find the room illuminated by a red glow from the stove, now full of lurid logs. I rubbed my eyes, but even as I did, I caught the sound of approaching footsteps, the sharp rat-a-tat-tat of high-heeled shoes. Nearer they came, right up to the entrance of my room, when, to my astonishment, the door gently opened, and in tiptoed my beautiful host. In one hand she carried a long-handled iron spoon, and in the other a candle. I was entranced. Never had I seen such a wealth of rich golden hair, such red lips, such lovely china blue eyes, and such a heavenly figure. She was a goddess, at least my idea of one. What did she want? I sat up in bed and was about to speak when she laid a finger on her lips and bade me be silent. She then went to the grate and, taking from her pocket a small lump of lead, carefully put it onto the spoon, which she balanced with the utmost care over the fire. I suddenly became conscious of someone close to me, and glancing around, saw, lying by my side, an old man with long grizzled hair and beard, whose features were vaguely familiar. He was sound asleep, his breathing loud and raucous. Looking up, I saw the girl flash me a look of subtle warning. "Don't wake him, whatever you do," her eyes said. "He must sleep on." Cautiously, the girl lifted the spoon from the fire, bore it steadily to the bed, and gaily motioning me to keep quiet, she gently turned the sleeper's head over on the pillow, and with a dexterous movement of her clever, subtle fingers, poured the hissing lead into his ear. There was an agonizing scream. The eyes of the old man opened convulsively, and in that moment I recognized my father. Almost simultaneously came a loud crash, blinding darkness, and I was once again, God knows how, in the darkened forest. At dawn, I finally reached Garvois. Arriving at the gate of my father's house, I found it padlocked, and there was a notice, "To be let or sold." I then staggered to the nearest house, the house of my old friend, Henry Crozier. Henry had just awakened, and shuffling downstairs, he opened the door. "Le diable!" he exclaimed. "It's Bertram! So you've come back!" "Come back to find the place empty. Tell me, where's my father?" "What?" he said. You don't know? My poor Bertram, your father is dead. He died a fortnight ago, the day after his marriage with Mademoiselle Marie Deville. Marie Deville, the niece of his last housekeeper." What killed him? Why, old age, of course. But the woman, what was she like? I stammered. Why, Henry said slowly, she was what some people would call beautiful, though as God is my judge, I did not admire her. Fair, very fair, blonde, painted lips, and big, very big eyes, china blue and smiling, eternally smiling. Such was Bertram's account of his strange experience. In answer to O'Donnell's questions, he said he had searched the wood thoroughly, but there was no house in it. Afterwards, having had his father's body secretly exhumed and finding lead in the ear, he had obtained an order for the arrest of his stepmother. She was, however, nowhere to be found, and he supposed that, having got wind of the affair, she had escaped out of the country. Bertram told his story with every appearance of sincerity, and O'Donnell had no doubt at all that it was true. All of it. True. The moral of the story: older people who marry much younger people may regret having been led to the altar. The case of another haunting in Canada was told Elliott O'Donnell by a Dr. Fanshawe and his wife, who had had a rather curious experience. The doctor took from his pocket a small leather pouch, and opening it, showed O'Donnell a dull blue stone. "Are you a geologist?" the doctor said. "No," O'Donnell replied. "What is it?" "No one has ever been able to tell me," the doctor said. "I have shown it to several professors, and they have each classified it differently. None of them had ever seen a stone like it. But let me tell you the history of the stone. 5 years ago, we rented a house on the outskirts of London, Ontario. It was a 2-story house standing back from the road. Opposite the house was a large pit, a disused quarry. Rain had filled it with water that was icy cold even in summer. Viewed in daytime, the quarry was ordinary enough. But at dusk, I remember marveling at this metamorphosis the first day of our arrival. It was July, and the landscape was vividly aglow with brilliant sunlight, a more radiant scene you could not imagine. "One might make a capital swimming hole of this," I said to my wife, as we wandered to the edge of the pit and peered down at the silent, sparkling water. That was in the morning. In the evening, the place looked very different. In fact, I hardly recognized it. It had undergone a complete change. The banks were higher, the water dark and sinister, and there was a cold dreariness about the place that made me shiver. It was utterly forlorn and murderous. On the opposite bank were a few rank sedges and the white trunks of decaying trees adding to the general dreariness. I suddenly felt I was being watched, and looking up, I saw, on the opposite bank, a huge granite boulder. I was sure something was behind it, crouching down and glaring at me. I also felt convinced that this thing, which I could not actually see, was some strange hybrid of a man and animal, a thing with limbs like ours, but the face of some fantastic, mocking, malevolent beast. Filled with a great uneasiness and all manner of vague fears, I hurried back to the house. I said nothing about it to my wife, but 2 days later she came to me in a state of great agitation. "Why, what is the matter, Margaret?" I cried. "You've gone very white. Are you ill?" "No," she said, "but I've had a shock." "I was walking in the garden," she said, "when I heard a great rustling of leaves. I turned round and saw a violent agitation going on in the branches of an apple tree. I came nearer, and as I did, something heavy dropped to the earth with a loud thud. I felt something brush past, and I was touched by something immeasurably foul. I reeled right back, and then ran back to the house." "And you saw nothing?" "Nothing." Dr. Fanshawe continued, "That night we were awakened by the barking of Pat, our Newfoundland dog. I went downstairs and found him standing, hair erect, looking out the window of the front door. I had my revolver and went to the window, and looking out saw nothing. But Pat was beside himself with terror. 'What is it, Pat?' I said, when there came a violent hammering at the door. 'Who's there?' I yelled. 'I'm armed.' And there being no reply, I threw the door open, but there was no one there. No one. I searched the garden, without Pat, who wouldn't come, but found no one. For a week nothing happened. Then all sorts of noises were heard in the house, footsteps, heavy breathing, the rattling of door handles, and, most alarming of all, violent pounding on the doors. The servants were terrified. The maid roused us in the middle of the night, screaming, and going to her room, we found her in hysterics. The clothes had been stripped off her bed and thrown in a heap on the floor. She told us something had come into her room and tried to suffocate her. She felt as if all the breath in her body was being sucked out of her. She had seen nothing. We told her it was all a nightmare. But next morning, she was seriously ill and died within a fortnight." O'Donnell wondered if the maid had been healthy before. "Rather," Dr. Fanshawe laughed. "She was a rosy-cheeked, strong, typical young Canadian. Heart and lungs absolutely sound. I diagnosed her case and was puzzled, for she had died of acute anemia." On the night after our maid's funeral, we were again disturbed by Pat's barking. I got up and went to the bedroom window. The weather was very unsettled. Clouds scudded across the moon, and the wind whistled dolefully through the leaves of the maples. Suddenly I heard the sound of heavy footsteps crunching their way along the gravel drive, and then I got a shock. Coming towards the house with short, quick steps was a tall figure with its head bowed low. Its arms and legs were long and bony, the feet and hands enormous. It was nude, its blue-gray body glowing in the moonlight. The thing came beneath the window and raised its face, which was not human, partially covered with hair, and which had huge eyes glaring with an expression of pure hatred. It was something damned, too utterly vicious and evil for words. Mrs. Fanshawe who had joined her husband at the window, said, "We were both overcome, and for some seconds neither of us could move. We both just stared. At last it made some slight movement, and my husband, who had his revolver, fired at it. The bullet went right through it and struck the gravel on the path behind it, but the thing was unharmed and moved towards the front door. He fired again, and in my terror I began to pray. And then my husband threw something that struck the thing full in the face, and it vanished. Vanished. I said to Richard, my husband, "What did you throw?" "A stone I picked up near the quarry," he replied. "I don't know why I threw it, but when you started praying, something told me to throw it." It was quiet after that, and in the morning Richard found and showed me the stone you were looking at now. We had it fixed to the front door and were never troubled again. There was no history attached to the place, Dr. Fanshawe added, and no one we spoke to had ever heard of it being haunted. Now, what do you make of it? After a moment, O'Donnell replied, "I think this stone is the clue to the mystery. Certain blue rocks, especially those found in lava beds, are known to keep ghosts at bay. My supposition," O'Donnell continued, "is that your place does have a history. It was once badly haunted by spirits of the most dangerous type, which I call elementals or neutrarians. These neutrarians are spirits that have never had a physical body and are only to be found in very remote and isolated places where the soil is rarely disturbed. They hate human beings. They hate human beings because they covet human bodies. Some neutrarians can reveal themselves at will. Others must steal vitality from people in order to appear. Now, your house didn't seem to be haunted. It was only when you looked at the quarry that you felt uneasy. The theory that the hauntings originated in the quarry is supported by you finding the blue stone there. It must have been buried there in the past to keep the ghost in check, and when you found it and took it away, the haunting started. It drew its energy and vitality from the maid and drained the life out of her. You saved yourselves when you threw the blue stone at it and then fixed the stone to your front door." "But is the haunting to go on forever?" Mrs. Fanshawe said. "Is there no means of ending it, save by the blue stone?" "No," O'Donnell said. "I think a haunting by a neutrarian could last forever. Have you heard anything lately about the house?" But the Fanshawes knew nothing about the current situation. A year later, Dr. Fanshawe sent O'Donnell the following note: "I have been to the house, and the present occupants are leaving. There have been 3 deaths, and they have seen it. I have lent them the blue stone." The moral of the story, sung in my best Bob Dylan voice: if some blue ghost won't leave you alone, that's a ghost that must get stoned. Elliott O'Donnell, the famed Anglo-Irish ghost hunter, was dining with a very old friend when the friend suddenly said, "Do you believe in vampires?" O'Donnell was immediately interested and said, "Tell me, I am listening." "Well," the friend said, "I had an extraordinary experience a few months ago, and the horror of it so overpowers me that I feel I must share my secret with someone. And you, well, I know you're an authority on such matters." After lighting a cigarette, the friend commenced his story, which went like this. "I had been away from England for nearly 3 years. In Canada, eh? A few nights after my return, I was dining at my club when someone tapped me on the shoulder, and turning round, I saw my old friend, Stamford. As I had no idea he was in London, you may imagine my delight. He joined me at dinner, and we went over old times together. Stamford wanted to know if I had heard anything from our mutual friend Jack. I said I had had a few lines from him about 6 months previously, announcing his marriage, but that I hadn't heard from him since. Stamford then told me that he had not seen Jack since his engagement, or even heard from him. In fact, he had written to him twice, but had received no answer. There were whispered rumors that Jack was looking ill and unhappy. Hearing this, I got Jack's address from Stamford and made up my mind I would run down and see him. About a week afterwards, I found myself stopping outside a beautiful English country house, which appeared to be entirely isolated from any other dwelling. A few more minutes, and I was standing before a blazing log fire in a fine old hall, eagerly awaiting my old friend. I didn't wait long before Jack appeared, and with slow, painfully slow steps crossed the hall to greet me. He was wasted to a shadow, and I felt a lump rise in my throat as I thought of the splendid, athletic man I used to know. He made no mention of his wife, and though I was naturally anxious to see her, I was glad that Jack and I were alone. We chatted together regardless of the time, and it was not until the first gong had sounded that I thought of dressing for dinner. After getting dressed, I was going downstairs when I suddenly felt that I was being watched. I looked around and could see no one, but I heard a low musical laugh just above my head, and looking up, I saw a figure leaning over the banisters. The beauty of the face dazzled me for a moment, and the loveliness of the eyes, which seemed to shine a red gold, held me spellbound. Presently, a voice, as lovely as the face, said, "So, you are Jack's chum." The most beautiful woman I have ever seen then came slowly down the stairs, and slipping her arm through mine, led me to the dining room. As her hand rested on my arm, I remember noticing that her fingers were long and thin and pointed, and the nails so polished that they shone red. Indeed, everything about her shone red, with the exception of her skin, which shone white. At dinner she was lively, but she ate and drank very sparingly, and as though food was disgusting to her. Soon after dinner, I felt so exceedingly tired and sleepy, that I found it almost impossible to keep awake, absolutely impossible to keep awake, and I asked my host and hostess to excuse me. I woke up next morning feeling languid and tired, and while shaving, I noticed a curious red mark at the base of my neck. I imagined I must have cut myself shaving hurriedly the evening before, and thought nothing more about it. But the following night, after dinner, I experienced the same sensation of sleepiness and felt as if I had been drugged. It was impossible to keep awake, so I again asked to be excused. On this occasion, after I had retired, a curious thing happened. I dreamed, or at least I suppose I dreamed, that I saw my door slowly open and a woman carrying a candle in one hand come noiselessly into the room. It was Jack's wife. She was clad in a loose red gown, and a great rope of hair hung over one shoulder. Again, those red gold eyes looked into mine. Again I heard that low musical laugh, and this time I felt powerless either to speak or to move. She leaned down, nearer and nearer to me. Her eyes gradually assumed a fiendish and terrible expression, and with a sucking noise which was horrible to hear, she fastened her crimson lips to the little wound on my neck. I remembered nothing more until the morning. The place on my neck, I thought, looked more inflamed, and as I looked at it, my dream came vividly back, and I began to wonder if it was only a dream. I felt frightfully rotten, so rotten that I decided to return to town that day. And yet I yielded to some strange fascination and determined to stay another night. At dinner, I drank sparingly, and making the same excuse as on the previous nights, I retired to bed. I lay awake until midnight, waiting for I know not what, when suddenly the door gently opened, and I saw Jack's wife. Slowly she came towards me, gliding as stealthily as a snake. I waited until she leaned over me, until I felt her breath on my cheek, and then I flung my arms around her. I had just time to see the mad terror in her eyes as she realized I was awake, and the next instant, like an eel, she had slipped from my grasp and was gone. I never saw her again. I left early the next morning, and I shall never forget dear old Jack's face when I said goodbye to him. It is only a few days ago I learned of Jack's death. The moral of the story: it's a bad thing to covet your friend's spouse, but it's worse when they covet you. If this is your first visit to my channel, please consider subscribing. My name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring such cryptids as the Night Floaters, werewolves, and the Black-Eyed Children. So again, please consider subscribing. Please help me to reach my goal of 2,022 subs in 2022. And I'm so close now. So close. So why not subscribe today? Or tonight? Or first thing tomorrow? Till midnight. Cheers. Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pix here, that's PX here, while the music was Unseen Horrors. Unseen Horrors by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod. Unseen Horrors, a piece that always makes me think of the old Hammer horror movies.